Normandy, the morning of June 6, 1944. A German artilleryman of the 2nd Battery, Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260, is pressed into the concrete of an observation bunker at the very tip of a promontory called Pointe du Hoc. Below him, a cliff drops 100 feet straight into the English Channel. He has been told, by every officer who ever briefed him, that this cliff is the one part of his position he never needs to worry about. The sea approaches are covered by fire, the beaches to either side are miles away, and the wall of rock beneath his feet is, in the settled judgment of the German engineers who fortified this coast, simply unclimbable. No sane enemy would come at him from the water and try to scale a vertical cliff under fire. It is not a defensive concern, it is a physical impossibility. He has spent the last several weeks watching Allied bombers turn the ground around him into something that no longer looks like Earth. The craters are 10 feet deep in places. The soil has been thrown up and turned over so many times that the position resembles the surface of the moon. But he is alive, and his bunker held, and the naval shells that hammered the point at dawn have finally lifted. The smoke is beginning to clear. For a moment, in the strange quiet that follows a bombardment, he might have believed the worst was over, and then a man's head appears over the edge of the cliff. Then another, then another. They are muddy, soaked, exhausted, and they are carrying weapons, and they have come up the 100 feet of rock that could not be climbed. They have come from the sea, up the impossible wall, and they are already firing. The German soldiers who lived through that morning, and the many who were captured in the days that followed, would try to describe what they had witnessed to their American interrogators. And what they said, or in some crucial cases what they conspicuously failed to say, sits at the center of one of the most misunderstood engagements of the entire Normandy campaign. Because the popular story of Pointe du Hoc has hardened over 80 years into a legend, and the legend has quietly buried a set of harder and more interesting truths. This is an attempt to recover them, not the myth of what the defenders felt, but the documented record of what actually happened on that point, what the guns were really doing there, and what the men on the losing side of it genuinely reported when the fighting stopped. The obvious explanation for what happened at Pointe du Hoc is that American soldiers were braver, or fitter, or simply better men than the Germans who held the ground. That explanation is emotionally satisfying, and it is almost entirely useless, because it explains nothing about why the assault worked. The Germans on that point were not cowards, and they were not weak. In the days that followed the cliff assault, they counterattacked so ferociously that they nearly wiped the attackers out. The men who scaled the cliff were extraordinary, but they did not succeed because the enemy was contemptible. They succeeded for reasons that are far more specific, far less flattering to the myth, and far more revealing about how the entire invasion was designed to work. To understand what the German prisoners were really describing, you have to first understand exactly what they were defending and why the Allied High Command was willing to spend some of its finest soldiers to take it. Start with the ground itself. Pointe du Hoc is a blunt finger of rock that juts into the channel on the Normandy coast, roughly 4 miles west of the center of the beach the Americans would codename Omaha, and a comparable distance east of the beach they called Utah. Its position is the entire point of its importance. A battery placed here does not threaten one landing zone, it threatens both, and it threatens the vast fleet of ships lying offshore in between. The cliff that defines the promontory rises about 100 feet from a narrow, stony beach, and for most of its length it is close to vertical. It is precisely the kind of natural obstacle that makes a defender comfortable. On top of that rock, beginning in 1943, the German army built a coastal battery. The armament was 6 heavy guns, French-made pieces of First World War vintage, 155mm weapons, taken from captured French stocks, and pressed into German service. These were not small guns, they could throw a shell more than 12 miles. From the top of Pointe du Hoc, that range covered the approaches to both American beaches and a wide stretch of the crowded sea lanes between them. The battery was manned by the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260. Around the guns, the Germans laid out the standard furniture of the Atlantic Wall: concrete casemates, open gun pits, machine gun positions, an ammunition magazine, and a heavily built observation post right at the edge of the cliff, from which an officer could direct the fire of the battery onto anything that moved on the water. It is worth being precise about who the German defenders actually were, because the popular image of a monolithic Nazi garrison does not match the reality. The gunners themselves belonged to an Army coastal artillery unit, specialists whose job was to serve the heavy pieces, not to fight as infantry. Around them, the defense of the promontory and the surrounding sector drew on elements of the German infantry divisions holding that part of the coast, formations that included the 716th Infantry Division and, close by, the 352nd Infantry Division. These were not uniform bodies of hardened fanatics. The static coastal divisions strung along that part of the Atlantic Wall were, as a class, a mixed bag. They contained German veterans and young conscripts, but the German command also filled out these low-priority defensive formations with older men, with soldiers rated unfit for the mobile divisions fighting in the east, and in many sectors with foreign conscripts pressed into service from occupied territories, men of uncertain loyalty who had been put in German uniform to hold ground they had no personal stake in. This matters for the story because it complicates the neat picture of an elite American force overcoming an elite German one. The men who actually served the guns were trained artillery specialists, and the grenadiers who counterattacked the point over the following 2 days fought hard and skillfully. But coastal defense along this stretch of front, taken as a whole, rested in part on second-line troops, not on the cream of the German army. The picture is human and messy, not a clean contest of supermen. This is why Pointe du Hoc mattered. Allied planners, studying aerial photographs for months, concluded that this single battery was one of the most dangerous individual positions on the entire invasion front. 6 guns of that caliber, firing in a controlled and observed pattern onto packed landing craft and troops wading ashore, could inflict a catastrophe. General Dwight Eisenhower's planners identified the neutralization of this battery as an essential precondition for the landings on the beaches it overlooked. The guns had to be gone before the first waves hit the sand. The question was how to do it. Bombing had been tried, and tried heavily. The point was struck from the air in April, again in May, and again in the small hours of June 6 itself. Naval gunfire was added to the plan, with the old battleship Texas assigned to pound the position before the landings. But a coastal battery inside thick concrete is a maddeningly hard thing to destroy from above or from the sea. Bombs crater the ground, and shells scar the concrete, but the guns inside can survive. The planners could not assume the battery had been silenced from a distance. Someone was going to have to climb up onto that point, on foot, and physically confirm that the guns were destroyed. That job was handed to a new and specialized kind of American soldier. The United States Army Rangers had been created in imitation of the British commandos, trained for exactly the sort of raid that ordinary infantry were not equipped to attempt. For Pointe du Hoc, the mission fell principally to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by a 34-year-old former teacher and college football coach from Texas named Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. Rudder was not a distant staff officer. He would land with his men and command from the beach at the foot of the cliff. The plan his force trained for was audacious to the point of sounding insane. They would cross the channel in small landing craft, run into the narrow beach directly beneath the cliff, and then climb the 100 feet of vertical rock using ropes fired to the top by rockets, extension ladders, and in some cases their bare hands and bayonets, all while the German defenders stood at the top of the cliff shooting down at them and rolling grenades over the edge. Even some of the Americans thought it could not be done. The doubt on the Allied side was real, and it was voiced plainly. A line often repeated in accounts of the planning holds that a senior officer scoffed that a few old women with brooms could keep the Rangers off that cliff. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, they capture the honest professional assessment of the odds, and they capture something essential about why the German garrison felt so secure. The impossibility of the cliff was not a piece of American propaganda invented afterward. It was the honest opinion of experienced soldiers on both sides. The cliff really was a brutal obstacle, and a determined defender at the top really should have been able to hold it against almost any force coming up from below. The doubt reached right into the ranks of the Rangers themselves, and it produced one of the most revealing incidents in the whole run-up to the operation. The 3 assault companies of the 2nd Battalion, the ones assigned to climb the cliff, were originally to be led by a major named Cleveland Lytle. During a final briefing aboard ship the night before the landing, word reached the officers that French resistance sources were reporting the guns had already been pulled off the point. Lytle, by several accounts fortified with a good deal of alcohol, became loudly convinced that the assault was now pointless and suicidal, that they would be throwing away lives to storm a cliff and seize a battery that no longer held any guns. He said so, forcefully, in front of the men. Rudder relieved him of his command on the spot. His reasoning was simple and hard. A commander who does not believe in his mission cannot lead men up a cliff into fire to accomplish it. Rudder would take the assault companies himself. It is worth holding on to that detail, because it means the men who climbed the cliff did so under a commander who had already been warned the guns might be gone, and who had decided the position had to be taken and searched regardless. The initiative that would define the whole battle was baked into it before the first boat touched the water. The Ranger plan was more elaborate than a single climb. Rudder's assault force, the 3 companies that would scale the point directly from the sea, was only one part of it. A much larger body of Rangers, the rest of the 2nd Battalion, and the whole of the 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, waited offshore. If Rudder's men took the cliff and signaled success within a set window, this second force would follow them in and land at the foot of the point to reinforce the position. If no signal came, the assumption would be that the cliff assault had failed, and the follow-up force would instead land on Omaha Beach and fight its way overland to Pointe du Hoc from the landward side. The entire scheme balanced on a single flare fired from the cliff top at the right moment. It was an elegant plan on paper. In the event, the delay would break it, and the breaking of it would leave Rudder's men catastrophically alone. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that go past the legend and into the documented record of what actually happened, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach the people who care about getting it right. Now hold that German confidence in your mind, because the assault did not begin the way anyone intended. It began with a mistake, and the mistake very nearly wrecked the entire operation before a single Ranger touched the cliff. The flotilla of landing craft set out in darkness through a rough sea. The little boats took water over the sides constantly, and the men spent the crossing bailing with their helmets, soaked and freezing and violently seasick. In the poor light and the confusion, the lead craft steered toward the wrong headland. Instead of running straight for Pointe du Hoc, the boats angled toward another point of rock off to the east, closer to Omaha. By the time the error was caught, and the flotilla turned to run parallel to the coast toward its actual target, roughly 40 minutes had been lost. 40 minutes does not sound like much until you understand what it cost. The entire plan depended on the Rangers hitting the beach at the very moment the naval and air bombardment lifted, so that they would be climbing while the German defenders were still stunned and pinned in their holes. Instead, the bombardment lifted on schedule at about 6:30 in the morning, and the Rangers were not there. They were still out on the water, running a gauntlet along the coast under fire, arriving at the base of the cliff around 10 minutes past 7. That delay handed the German defenders something priceless. It gave them time to recover from the shelling, come up out of their bunkers, and man the edge of the cliff before the Americans arrived beneath it. The run along the coast was costly in itself. This was not a bloodless approach that only turned dangerous at the cliff. As the little craft ploughed eastward parallel to the shore, under the guns of a coast that was now fully awake, the force began to lose men and equipment before it had even arrived. One of the landing craft carrying troops swamped and went down in the rough water, and only a single man from it survived. A supply craft was lost as well. One of the amphibious trucks, the ones hauling the tall extension ladders borrowed from a city fire brigade in London, was knocked out by German fire and sank. By the time Rudder's boats finally grounded at the foot of the point, the assault force was already reduced. Of the small number of men who had set out to make the climb, only a portion were still in the fight, and they had spent the last stretch of the approach soaked, sick, and taking casualties from a shore they could not yet reach. There was a second, quieter consequence of the delay, and it would prove even more expensive than the lost boats. The larger follow-up force under Schneider was waiting offshore for the signal that Rudder had taken the point. That signal, a flare, was supposed to come within a narrow window. Because Rudder landed so late, the flare that should have summoned the reinforcements went up long after the deadline had passed. Schneider, seeing no signal in time, did exactly what the plan told him to do in the case of apparent failure. He turned his force away from Pointe du Hoc and took it into Omaha Beach to fight ashore there and come overland. It was the correct decision under the rules he had been given. It was also the decision that stranded Rudder's men. The reinforcements who were supposed to climb up behind them and hold the point in strength were now committed miles away, on the bloodiest beach of the entire invasion, and it would be 2 days before any meaningful help reached the cliff. So the assault that the Germans faced was not a surprise falling on stunned men. By the time the Rangers grounded on the narrow beach, the defenders were awake, alert, and looking straight down at them. Machine gun fire and rifle fire came down the cliff face. Grenades, the German stick grenades the Americans called potato mashers, were lobbed over the top to tumble down among the men at the bottom. The Rangers fired their rocket-propelled grappling hooks up the cliff, trailing ropes, but many of the ropes were soaked and heavy from the crossing and fell short, and others were cut or thrown back off the edge by the defenders above. The clay of the cliff, churned and loosened by the bombardment, came away in the climbers' hands. Men were shot off the ropes and fell, and still they climbed, using ropes where the ropes held, using ladders, using footholds gouged into the soft clay. The first Rangers began hauling themselves over the lip of the cliff, within minutes, straight into the fire of the defenders waiting for them. Consider the specific physics of what the Rangers were attempting, because it explains why the defenders felt so safe, and why they were nonetheless overcome. To climb, a Ranger needed a rope anchored at the top of the cliff. The ropes were sent up by small rockets fired from the landing craft, dragging the lines behind them to hook over the lip of the cliff. But the ropes had soaked up seawater on the long, wet approach, and a soaked rope is far heavier than a dry one. Many of the rockets could not drag the sodden lines all the way to the top, and the ropes fell back short. Of the ropes that did catch, the defenders at the top could lean out, saw at them, or simply cut them and drop the climbers. A man halfway up 100 feet of rope, weighed down with weapons and soaked wool and mud, was as helpless a target as combat produces. The German at the top had gravity, cover, and time. The Ranger below had none of those things. By every rule of the tactical mathematics, the men at the top should have won. What the mathematics left out was the churned clay of the cliff face itself. The bombardment that had failed to destroy the guns had done one useful thing. It had torn up the top edge of the cliff and dumped tons of loosened earth down the face, building up mounds of soft clay at the base and studding the slope with fresh handholds and footholds. Where the ropes failed, some Rangers went up the clay itself, digging in with bayonets and boots, and where the bombardment had collapsed sections of the cliff into rough ramps, they scrambled up those. The defenders, leaning out to fire straight down, exposed themselves to the Rangers' own covering fire from below and from the automatic rifles the first men up brought to bear. It was not a clean victory of will over rock. It was a brutal, improvised scramble in which 100 small factors, the loosened clay, the covering fire, the speed of the first men over the top, tipped a contest that on paper the Germans should have won handily. The margin was thin. It very nearly went the other way. The casualties in this phase are worth stating precisely, because they cut against another part of the legend. The climb itself, murderous as it looks, was not where most of the Rangers died. By the time the leading men reached the top of the cliff, the assault force had suffered around 15 casualties on the beach and the rock face. The cliff was terrible, but it was survivable, and it was survived. The truly ruinous losses came later, and they came not from climbing, but from holding. When the Rangers clawed over the top, they found themselves in a landscape that had been beaten almost beyond recognition. The repeated bombing and the naval barrage had turned the point into a wasteland of overlapping craters, shattered concrete, broken wire, and torn earth. In some ways this helped the attackers, because the craters gave them cover, and the pulverized ground made it hard for the defenders to move and counterattack in the open. The Rangers pushed across this moonscape toward the gun casemates that were the entire reason they had come, and there they made the discovery that has fueled the biggest single misunderstanding about the whole operation. The guns were not there. The concrete emplacements, the ones the Rangers had studied on aerial photographs and rehearsed against on models for weeks, stood open and empty. In several of the positions, the Germans had done something clever. They had run telephone poles out through the emplacements, dark timber that from the height of a reconnaissance aircraft looked convincingly like the barrels of heavy guns. The Americans had scaled an impossible cliff and fought their way across a shattered battlefield to destroy 6 heavy guns, and the guns had been replaced by painted wooden poles. For a moment, to the men standing in those empty pits, the whole mission must have seemed like a bitter joke. Here is where the legend takes a wrong turn, and it is worth stopping to correct it carefully, because the correction is the key to everything the German prisoners would later reveal. The story that hardened over the decades, repeated in books and documentaries, is that the guns had been withdrawn entirely, that Pointe du Hoc was a dry hole, and that the Rangers climbed the cliff and died for an objective that was never there. That version is wrong. It is one of the most persistent errors in the popular history of D-Day, and the documented record refutes it plainly. The guns had not been removed from the fight. They had been moved. In the weeks before the invasion, under the pressure of the very air raids that were tearing up the point, the Germans had pulled their 6 heavy guns back off the exposed clifftop and hidden them inland, away from the bombing, in a concealed position where they could be preserved until they were needed. This was not a retreat. It was sound artillery practice. The guns did not need to sit on the cliff to do their job. They needed only to be intact, supplied with ammunition, and connected to an observer who could see the target. The observer would stay in his post at the edge of the cliff, watching the beaches and the sea. The guns themselves could sit safely inland and still rain shells down onto Utah Beach the moment the order came, which means that when the Rangers stood in those empty emplacements, the danger they had been sent to eliminate was not gone. It was intact, hidden, roughly a kilometer inland from the cliff edge, pointed at the beach where thousands of American soldiers were coming ashore. And this is the moment that separates the men who took Pointe du Hoc from the legend that later grew up around them. They did not stand in the empty pits and conclude the mission was pointless. Small patrols pushed off the battered point and moved inland to find where the guns had gone. The man whose name is fixed to what happened next was a first sergeant in Dog Company named Leonard Lomel, a young man from New Jersey who had already been wounded in the side during the landing and had climbed the cliff anyway. Moving inland with Staff Sergeant Jack Coon covering him, Lomel followed a sunken country lane and pushed through the hedgerows that quilt that part of Normandy. And there, hidden under camouflage in an orchard perhaps a quarter mile beyond the coastal road, he found them. 5 of the 6 heavy guns, lined up in a firing position, their long barrels raised and pointed toward Utah Beach. Around them lay stacks of ammunition, everything needed to open fire. The guns were ready. They were simply, for the moment, unmanned. Across an open field, Lomel could see roughly 100 German soldiers gathered together, apparently forming up, the gun crews and their supporting infantry, waiting for the order to man the battery. It is one of the strangest and most consequential pauses of the entire day. The Germans were in no particular hurry, because in their understanding of the situation they still held the cards. Until their infantry drove the Americans off the point and reoccupied the observation post at the cliff edge, the guns could not be aimed with any accuracy anyway. They were waiting, sensibly, for the tactical picture to resolve before they committed their artillery. They did not know that the enemy was already standing among their guns. Lomel did not hesitate. He told Kuhn to give him his grenades and cover him. Then he ran to the guns alone. He carried thermite grenades, incendiary devices that burn at a temperature high enough to melt metal. Working fast, he set thermite in the moving mechanisms of two of the guns, in the recoil and traversing gears, and the intense heat welded the metal parts into a single ruined mass. A gun with its traversing mechanism fused solid cannot be aimed and cannot fire. He smashed the sights of a third gun with the butt of his submachine gun. Then, aware that he did not have enough thermite to finish the job, he and Kuhn slipped back to the American lines, gathered up every thermite grenade their comrades could spare, and returned to the orchard to finish what they had started. By the time they were done, the guns of Pointe du Hoc were destroyed. A separate Ranger patrol accounted for the remaining piece. The great fear that had justified the entire operation, 6 heavy guns firing onto the invasion beaches, had been eliminated by a handful of men with incendiary grenades, working on foot, deep inside enemy territory, without a shot fired at them in the act. Then the ammunition supply blew up in a tremendous explosion, showering the 2 sergeants with rock and debris, and they pulled back and sent word to rudder by runner that the guns had been found and finished. It was about 9 in the morning. The offensive mission of the 2nd Ranger Battalion was complete, and at that exact moment everything got worse, because now the Rangers were victims of their own success and their own isolation. They had climbed an impossible cliff, taken a fortified point, and destroyed the guns, but they had done it as a small, lightly armed raiding force pushed far out ahead of the main invasion. They held a scrap of the Normandy coast with nothing heavier than light mortars and automatic rifles. They were cut off, their radios were failing, and the reinforcements the plan had promised were not coming. The larger Ranger force that was supposed to follow them up the cliff had been diverted to Omaha Beach when the delay threw the timetable into chaos. Rudder's men were on their own. What followed over the next 2 days is the part of the story that the legend tends to skip, and it is the part that matters most for understanding what the German prisoners eventually said. The Germans, recovering from the shock of the cliff assault, understood perfectly well how few Americans were actually on that point, and they came for them. Counterattacks pressed in from the German 9th 14th Grenadier Regiment, backed by elements drawn from the units holding that stretch of coast. Through the day, the Rangers pushed most of their strength inland off the point itself, setting up a blocking position astride the coastal road that ran between the towns of Grand Camp and Vierville. That road was the second half of their mission. Cutting it helped choke off German movement along the coast behind the beaches. Holding it, with a badly depleted force and almost no heavy weapons, was another matter. As the day wore on, the Rangers took whatever reinforcement they could get, and it was pitifully little. 3 paratroopers of the American 101st Airborne Division, dropped miles from their own target zone in the night, had walked toward the sound of the fighting and simply attached themselves to the Rangers. In the evening, a platoon of about 23 men from the 5th Rangers, led by a lieutenant named Charles Parker, arrived overland from Omaha, having fought their way across country to reach the point. Notably, they arrived shepherding a group of German prisoners they had taken on the way. That was the sum of the help that got through on the first day. A handful of lost paratroopers and 1 small platoon, against a German force that was gathering itself for a serious effort to retake the ground. The serious effort came after dark. Beginning late in the night, the Germans launched a sequence of 3 heavy counterattacks against the thin Ranger line. They probed, found the seams, and pushed. The fighting was close and confused, the kind of night action where men are firing at muzzle flashes and shapes a few yards away, and no one has a clear picture of the whole. In the darkness, the Germans drove the surviving Americans back off the coastal road and into a smaller and smaller perimeter, closer to the cliff edge. The final and heaviest blow came in the small hours of June 7th, around 3 in the morning, and it broke through. Men of 1 Ranger company were killed or captured where they stood. Men of another company never received the order to pull back and found themselves cut off behind the advancing Germans. Some of those men fought their way home. Others had no choice but to go to ground, hiding in the hedgerows and drainage ditches of the Norman farmland, waiting in the dark for a chance to slip back to their own lines or simply to survive until morning. A number of Rangers were overrun and taken prisoner in exactly this way. This detail deserves emphasis because it is the mirror image of the story's usual framing. We ask what German prisoners said about the Americans, but on the night of June 6th and into the 7th, the flow of prisoners ran in both directions. The Germans captured Rangers on Pointe du Hoc, and the Rangers captured Germans, and both sides spent that grim night holding men at gunpoint in the dark, unsure whether the next counterattack would free them or kill them. The tidy image of a clean American triumph does not survive contact with the record. What actually happened was a brutal, close-range, back-and-forth fight for survival by a surrounded force that had already accomplished its mission and now simply had to live through the consequences. There is one weapon in this fight that deserves credit it rarely gets, and it points straight back out to sea. Through the second day, as the Germans kept pressing, the destroyers lying off the coast became the Rangers' heavy artillery. The men on the point had almost nothing of their own to answer a massed attack, but they had, at last, working communication with the warships. A naval fire support party could call the destroyers' guns down onto German troops forming up for a counterattack, and those guns, far heavier than anything the Rangers carried, repeatedly broke up assaults before they could gather full weight. The isolated force on the cliff was not quite as alone as it looked. It had a line, however fragile, back to the fleet, and that line helped keep it alive. Help of a more direct kind was still painfully thin. Around the middle of the day, a small party organized by a veteran ranger officer came in from the sea in landing craft, bringing a modest number of men and, more importantly, ammunition to a force that was running dangerously low. When those craft turned back, they carried away something that tells you the true state of things on the point. They took off 34 wounded Rangers, and they took off 28 German prisoners, ferried out to the old battleship offshore. Read that again. In the middle of a desperate defense by a force reduced to a fraction of its strength, the Rangers were holding and evacuating 28 enemy prisoners. That is the concrete, documented answer to the question of what happened between the Rangers and their German captives. Not a colorful quotation, but a boatload of prisoners taken off a contested cliff under fire, evidence of a fight in which the Americans were still capturing and holding enemy soldiers even as their own numbers bled away. By late on the night of June 7th, the German counterattacks had finally spent themselves, the attacking units out of men and out of momentum. The relief did not arrive until the morning of June 8th, 2 full days after the landing. It did not come easily. The Overland Relief Column, built around the 5th Rangers and a battalion of the 116th Infantry with tank support, had been held up short of the point the previous day by German resistance in the countryside, and by the higher priority the American command had placed on widening the Omaha beachhead, which was itself in serious trouble. Only on the morning of the 8th did a full attack finally push through to the point and clear it, the Germans pulling back westward toward Grand Camp. When the relief arrived, the men who had taken Pointe du Hoc were at the absolute end of their endurance. And this is where the single most quoted statistic of the battle comes from, and it deserves to be stated carefully because it is often mangled. Of the roughly 225 men who had set out to assault the point, only about 90 were still standing and able to bear arms when relief arrived, and some accounts, counting the men still truly fit to fight, put the figure lower still. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Either way, the proportion is staggering. A force built from some of the finest soldiers in the American Army had lost well over half its strength, by some measures around 70%, in seizing and holding a single promontory. There is a phrase that has attached itself to these men, and it is worth placing correctly, because it too has been smoothed by legend. The motto of the American Rangers, "Rangers lead the way," was not coined on the cliff of Pointe du Hoc. It was born a few miles east, on Omaha Beach, in the same hours. The follow-up Ranger force that had been diverted from the point landed into the slaughter on Omaha, where the assault had stalled and men were pinned and dying at the water's edge. A senior American general, moving among the stalled troops and trying to get the attack moving, came upon the Rangers and told them the beach had to be cleared, that the way inland had to be opened. Turning to their commander, he said in effect that if they were Rangers, then Rangers should lead the way. The men got up and pushed inland, and the phrase stuck, and it became the motto of the entire force. It belongs to Omaha as much as to Pointe du Hoc, but it fits the men on the cliff perfectly, because leading the way was exactly what they had done from the moment the first grappling hook went up. The motto describes a habit of mind that the whole operation had already demonstrated in the dark hours before it was ever spoken aloud. If you are finding this account worthwhile, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make the standard histories will find its way to you. So now we can finally ask the question this whole account has been building toward. After all of that, after the impossible climb and the empty guns and the desperate 2-day defense, what did the German prisoners actually say about the men who took Pointe du Hoc? And here we have to be honest, in a way that most tellings are not, because the honest answer is more interesting than the invented one. There is a famous and often repeated claim that the captured Germans stared at the cliff in disbelief and said they had never imagined men could climb it, that they simply could not comprehend an assault from the sea up that wall of rock. It is a wonderful line. It is exactly what we want the losers to have said, because it flatters the achievement and wraps it in a neat bow. But when you go looking for the hard source of that specific quotation, for the interrogation report, or the named prisoner who actually said those words, it becomes very difficult to pin down. Much of what circulates as German testimony about the cliff assault is the kind of quote that gets repeated because it feels true, not because it can be traced to a document. A careful account has to flag that clearly. The image of the astonished German prisoner marveling at the cliff is more legend than record. What the documented record does contain is quieter, stranger, and in some ways more revealing than the legend. It comes not from grand statements about the cliff, but from the confusion of ordinary German soldiers trying to make sense of an enemy who did not behave the way their entire understanding of the battle said he should. The German defenders of that sector had built their whole mental model of the coming invasion around fixed assumptions. The enemy would land on the beaches. The enemy would come where the terrain allowed. The cliff was safe. The flanks were the danger. And then men appeared on the point itself, from the direction that was supposed to be impossible, and began behaving with an aggression and an initiative that did not fit the picture at all. The deeper truth that emerges from the German side is not about awe at the cliff. It is about the collision between two completely different ways of fighting. The German defense of this coast was built on a doctrine of fixed positions, clear fields of fire, and centralized control. A gun battery had its assigned sector. An observer had his post. Infantry had their prepared positions. Everything was designed to function as a coordinated whole, directed from above, against an enemy who would present himself in an expected way. It was a rational and, in many places along the Atlantic Wall, a deadly effective system. What that system was not built to handle was a small group of highly trained men who would climb an unclimbable cliff, discover that their objective had vanished, refuse to accept that as an ending, push inland on their own initiative into unknown ground, find the hidden guns by following tracks and instinct, and destroy them with hand-carried grenades before anyone in the German chain of command had even registered that the point had fallen. The German gun crews, remember, were standing in a field 100 meters from their own artillery, waiting sensibly for orders and for the tactical situation to clarify, when the guns they were about to man were already being welded into scrap by a wounded American sergeant they never saw coming. That is the real story the German side tells. Not astonishment at a cliff, but a defensive system built for one kind of war being unstitched by soldiers fighting a completely different kind. This is why the myth that the guns were not there is so damaging, and why correcting it matters so much. If the guns were never there, then the German prisoners were describing a pointless American sacrifice, brave but wasted. But the guns were there. They were loaded, aimed at Utah Beach, and minutes away from being manned. The men who found and destroyed them were not the victims of a planning error. They were the reason a planning error, the moving of the guns, did not become an American catastrophe on the beach below. The initiative of a handful of sergeants closed a gap that the entire weight of the Allied bombing campaign had failed to close. That is the achievement the German experience actually testifies to, once you strip away the invented quotations and look at what the record supports. It is worth being clear about why the documented German record is thinner than we might wish, because the reason is itself part of the truth. Much of the German garrison did not survive to be interrogated in a calm room with a stenographer taking down its impressions of the cliff assault. Many defenders were killed in the bombardment, in the fighting on the point, and in the counterattacks. Those who were captured were funneled into a prisoner of war system that was, in those first chaotic days, overwhelmed with tens of thousands of men. The priority of an interrogator in June of 1944 was not to collect poignant reflections on American heroism, it was to extract immediate, actionable intelligence. Which units were in the line, where the reserves were, what the counterattack plans were. A captured German gunner's private astonishment at how the Americans had come up the cliff was, from the interrogator's point of view, worthless, so it mostly went unrecorded. The silence in the record is not proof the astonishment did not exist. It is a reminder that the historical record captures what someone at the time thought was worth writing down, and a defeated enemy's wonder rarely made that cut. What the wider interrogation record does capture, across the whole Normandy campaign, and not just this one point, is a pattern in how German soldiers described the American way of fighting, and it lines up precisely with what happened on Pointe du Hoc. In the days and weeks after D-Day, as American forces pushed inland, they kept running into German troops who were baffled less by American equipment than by American behavior, particularly the willingness to push forward aggressively and unpredictably rather than advancing in the slow, methodical, by-the-book manner the Germans expected. Prisoners taken in the fighting around the beachhead described the Americans in terms of unpredictability and relentless forward pressure, an enemy who did not wait for the tidy preconditions that German doctrine assumed. The men who took Pointe du Hoc were an extreme example of a broader pattern the German army would spend the rest of the campaign struggling to counter, an opponent whose junior leaders were trained and trusted to keep attacking on their own judgment, even when the plan had collapsed around them. And here is the deepest irony buried in the German experience of that point. The German army prided itself, correctly, on a tradition of pushing decision-making down to the man on the spot. Its own doctrine celebrated the sergeant and the lieutenant, who seized the initiative without waiting for orders. On paper, the Germans should have owned exactly the quality the Rangers displayed. But the specific task the Pointe du Hoc garrison had been handed, the static defense of a fortified coast, worked against that tradition at every turn. A coastal battery is not a maneuver unit. Its whole logic is to sit in a fixed position, tied to a fire plan, waiting for the enemy to appear where the plan predicts. The gun crews in that orchard were doing exactly what a coastal defense soldier is supposed to do, waiting sensibly for the situation to clarify before committing their guns. It was the Americans, cast as raiders with a single clear objective and freedom to improvise everything else, who got to fight the loose, aggressive, initiative-driven battle that German doctrine admired in theory. The defenders were trapped inside a role that suppressed their own best quality, and the attackers were handed a mission that unleashed theirs. That, far more than any difference in courage, is what the German side of Pointe du Hoc really testifies to. It is worth pausing on the human cost on the German side too, because it is part of the honest record. The defenders of Pointe du Hoc were not a faceless enemy. The battery crews, the machine gunners at the cliff edge, the grenadiers who counterattacked through the night, were soldiers doing their jobs inside a system that had told them the cliff was safe and the plan would hold. Many of them died. Others were marched off as prisoners, and in the confusion of that first night, some were held by Rangers who were themselves nearly out of ammunition and cut off from any support. A situation ripe for the kind of ugliness that happens at the edges of desperate fighting. The clean moral clarity of the legend does not quite survive the reality of a 2-day close-quarters battle fought by exhausted men on both sides. What survives is something harder and more valuable, an accurate picture of a specific fight, won by specific decisions, at a specific and terrible price. There is a further layer to the was it worth it question, and it deserves an honest hearing. because it has become one of the liveliest arguments in the study of this battle. In the years after 2004, a British collector and researcher named Gary Stern rediscovered and excavated a large German battery position a few miles inland from Pointe du Hoc, near the village of Maisie. This battery had been buried and largely forgotten after the war, missing from most of the popular histories. Stern argued, forcefully and controversially, that Maisie, not Pointe du Hoc, was the truly dangerous artillery position in that sector, that it kept firing on the American beaches for days after the landings, and that the fixation on the dramatic cliff at Pointe du Hoc had drawn attention away from the guns that did the real damage. In its strongest form, his thesis holds that the whole Pointe du Hoc assault was a costly misdirection, and that the story was tidied up afterward to protect a heroic legend. This argument has to be handled carefully, because it mixes a genuine and valuable discovery with claims that most professional historians do not accept. The genuine part is real. The Maisie battery existed, it was substantial, it was underappreciated in the standard accounts, and its rediscovery has enriched the history of the sector. But the strong claim, that Pointe du Hoc was pointless, and that its guns could not have mattered, runs into hard problems. The guns found and destroyed by the Rangers were real 155mm pieces, in firing positions, aimed at the invasion beaches, with ammunition stacked around them. Their range comfortably covered Utah Beach and the packed sea lanes offshore. Whether those particular guns could reach all the way to Omaha is genuinely disputed, and depends on exact ranges and positions that specialists still argue over. But a weapon does not have to threaten every beach to be worth destroying. A battery that could drop heavy shells onto Utah and onto the fleet was, by any reasonable standard, a target worth eliminating, and the men who eliminated it were not chasing a phantom. The lesson of Maisie is not that Pointe du Hoc was a waste. It is that the coast held more than one threat, that Allied intelligence was imperfect, and that the real history is more crowded and more complicated than the single, clean legend of one cliff and one battery. That is a more honest and, in its way, a more interesting conclusion than either the pure legend or the pure debunking. The battle for Pointe du Hoc did not stay quiet for long in the American memory. 4 decades after the landings, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1984, a president of the United States stood on that clifftop, in front of a jagged stone monument shaped like a Ranger dagger driven into the rock, and spoke to the survivors who had come back. He called them the boys of Pointe du Hoc, and he pointed to the men sitting in front of him, grey-haired now, and told the world that these were the men who took the cliffs. The speech fixed Pointe du Hoc permanently in the popular imagination. It was moving, and its central facts were sound. The men really had climbed the cliff, really had taken the point, and really had held it at a fearful cost. But a ceremony is not a history, and the speech, by its nature, gave the world the legend in its most polished form. It could not stop to explain that the guns had been moved rather than removed, or that the worst fighting came after the climb, or that the most quoted German reactions cannot be traced to any document. Those are the details that a careful account has to add back in. It is worth following the men themselves a little beyond the battle, because their later lives say something about the ordinary humanity behind the legend. James Earl Rudder, wounded twice on the point and directing the defense from the beach below through the worst of it, survived the war, went home to Texas, and eventually became the president of a large state university, remembered there as a builder and a leader rather than only as the man who climbed a cliff. Leonard Lomell, the sergeant who found the guns in the orchard, went back to New Jersey, became a lawyer, and lived into his 90s, quietly regarded by some historians as one of the most consequential individual soldiers of the entire day, on the strength of those few minutes with a satchel of thermite grenades. These were not mythic figures. They were a coach and a young man from a small town who were handed an impossible morning and met it, and then went home and lived long, useful, unremarkable lives, which is its own kind of answer to the war. The point itself was fought over again in the years that followed, not with weapons, but with words, as writers and veterans and historians argued over what it had all meant. Some concluded it had been a magnificent waste, others a decisive stroke, and the truth, as usual, sat somewhere more complicated than either verdict. What almost no one disputed was the quality of the men who had done it. 13 additional Rangers beyond Rudder were decorated with the second highest American award for valor for their actions in the Ranger missions of that day, and both Ranger battalions received a Presidential Unit Citation and the French Croix de Guerre. The recognition was real, and it was earned in a currency that the arguments over strategy could not touch. Whatever the guns were worth, the climbing of that cliff and the holding of that ground were acts of a specific and undeniable kind of courage. So let us end where we began, on the point itself, with the German artilleryman in his observation bunker watching muddy men come up over the edge of a cliff that could not be climbed. What was he really witnessing? Not, in the end, a demonstration that Americans were braver than Germans. Both armies produced brave men and frightened men in roughly equal measure, and the German counterattacks on that point were pressed with a courage no one should doubt. What he was witnessing was the failure of a set of assumptions. He had been taught that the cliff was a wall. It was a road. He had been taught that the guns were safe inland. They were a target. He had been taught that the battle would unfold according to a plan directed from above. Instead, it was unstitched by sergeants, making decisions in orchards and sunken lanes, faster than any German headquarters could respond. The men who took Pointe du Hoc did not win because the enemy was weak. They won because they were handed an impossible task and treated every part of it, the cliff, the missing guns, the isolation, the counterattacks, as a problem to be solved on their own initiative rather than a reason to stop. The guns were gone from the top, so they found them inland. The ropes fell short, so they climbed the clay. The plan collapsed, so they made a new one on the spot. That is the quality the German experience of that day actually testifies to, once the invented quotations are cleared away. Not astonishment at a cliff, but the slow, dawning recognition, across 2 days of fighting and years of interrogation reports, that they had been beaten by an enemy who would not stay inside the shape of the battle they had prepared for. The concrete bunkers still stand on Pointe du Hoc today, cracked and pitted, ringed by craters that 80 years of grass have not smoothed away. The observation post still looks out over the same grey water. Stand in it now, and the cliff below looks exactly as impossible as it did to the man who watched the Rangers come up it. That is the thing worth carrying away from this. The achievement was never made larger by pretending the enemy was small, or that the guns were absent, or that the losers said flattering things they may never have said. It stands on its own facts. A handful of men climbed a wall that could not be climbed, found guns that were supposed to be gone, destroyed them, and held the ground until relief came, and more than half of them fell doing it. The record does not need the legend. It was always more than enough. If this account gave you something to think about, or corrected something you thought you knew, a like and a subscribe help these stories reach the people who care about getting the history right, rather than just getting it told.